The boy stepped into the bank with quiet confidence, his dark brown eyes scanning the large hall filled with busy employees and customers. He was no stranger to the polished floors, the towering glass windows, and the hum of people discussing financial matters. Yet, this time, something felt different. He adjusted his backpack and made his way to the counter, ignoring the lingering stares as he clutched the bank slip in his hand. The woman behind the counter barely looked up from her computer screen when he approached. "Yes?" she asked, her voice laced with disinterest. "I need to make a withdrawal," he said, placing the slip on the counter. The teller finally glanced at him, her eyes narrowing. "A withdrawal?" she scoffed, eyeing his casual hoodie and sneakers. "From which account?" He pointed at the slip. "The details are right here." She picked it up, her frown deepening as she scanned the name. "This account belongs to a Mrs. Eleanor Sinclair." Her gaze snapped back to him, skepticism clear in her expression. "And who exactly are you?" "Her son," he replied evenly. There was a brief silence before she let out a small laugh. "Her son? Right. And I'm the Queen of England." She shook her head, shoving the slip back at him. "Nice try, kid. But I'm not about to let some random street kid waltz in and take money from one of our most prestigious clients." The word stung, but he kept his face impassive. "I can provide identification." She smirked. "Oh, please. A fake ID won't get you anywhere. Do you think we're that naive?" She gestured towards the security guard standing near the entrance. "Mark, can you escort this young man out? He's trying to pull a scam." The security guard, a tall, burly man, started toward them, but the boy remained still. "Call my mother," he said calmly. The teller let out an incredulous laugh. "Call your mother," she mocked. "Sure, let's do that. Maybe she'll explain why her so-called son thinks he can fool us." She picked up the phone and dialed number, her eyes never leaving him as she waited for an answer. Moments later, her expression shifted slightly. "Hello, Mrs. Sinclair. There's a young man here claiming to be your son, attempting to withdraw money from your account." She stopped mid-sentence. A sudden stiffness took over her posture. "Yes, ma'am, yes, I understand, but The color drained from her face. Her grip on the phone tightened. I had no idea," she stammered. "I deeply apologize, of course, immediately." She placed the receiver down, her hands trembling slightly. The security guard, who had been about to grab the boy's arm, hesitated. "What's wrong?" The teller's voice was barely a whisper. "He's telling the truth." A silence fell over them. The once dismissive expression on her face was now replaced with panic. The other staff members, who had been watching with mild amusement, were now shifting uncomfortably in their seats. A murmur spread through the bank as customers took notice. The boy tilted his head slightly. "So may I proceed with my transaction now?" The teller gulped. "Of course, sir." "Right away." Her hands fumbled as she processed the withdrawal, her usual arrogance replaced with nervous energy. But it wasn't over. The doors to the bank swung open, and in walked a woman who commanded instant attention. Dressed in an elegant yet commanding ensemble, Eleanor Sinclair carried an aura of power. Her sharp gaze scanned the room, landing on her son first, then the teller. The teller visibly shrank in her seat. "Mrs. Sinclair, I didn't." "Save it," Eleanor said coolly, her voice slicing through the air like a blade. "I heard everything." The entire bank seemed to hold its breath. "You humiliated my son," Eleanor continued, stepping closer. "You assumed, judged, and disrespected him without cause. Tell me, do you treat all young men who look like him this way?" The teller's face was now as pale as a sheet. "No, I mean it was just a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Eleanor's voice hardened. "Or an assumption based on his appearance?" The manager, who had remained silent up until now, hurried forward. "Mrs. Sinclair, please accept our sincerest apologies. This was an unfortunate mistake. It won't happen again." Eleanor's gaze snapped to him. "You're right. It won't. Because I own this bank." Gasps rippled through the room. The manager's face turned an alarming shade of red. "Effective immediately," Eleanor continued. "This employee is dismissed." And if I hear of any similar behavior from any staff member, I will personally ensure they never work in this industry again. Do I make myself clear?" The manager nodded rapidly, too terrified to speak. The teller's eyes filled with tears. "Please, Mrs. Sinclair. I need this job." I didn't mean." "You didn't mean?" Eleanor scoffed. "No, you meant exactly what you said. You thought my son didn't belong here. You thought he was a scammer, a nobody." She let out a breath, as if containing her fury. "I have no interest in excuses. You will not humiliate another young person under my watch. Collect your things and leave." The teller broke down into sobs as security escorted her away. The entire bank remained silent, no one daring to speak. Eleanor turned to her son, her expression softening. "Are you okay?" He nodded. "I knew you'd handle it." A small smile touched her lips. "That's what mothers do." The two of them walked out together, leaving behind a stunned audience. But the story wasn't over. Eleanor had made a decision, one that would change the way her bank operated forever. And the world was about to see just how powerful a mother's love and justice could be. Eleanor Sinclair and her son stepped out of the bank, the weight of the moment still hanging in the air. Her son, Marcus, walked beside her, his face calm, but Eleanor knew him well enough to sense the storm of emotions beneath the surface. "You handled that like a pro," Marcus said after a long silence. Eleanor glanced at him. "I had to. But it's not over yet." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Eleanor stopped at the curb, signaling for the driver to pull the car around. "That bank isn't just a business to me, Marcus. It's a reflection of my values. And today, I saw something I never should have seen in a place I built from the ground up." Marcus nodded slowly, beginning to understand. Eleanor's car, a sleek black sedan, rolled up, and they climbed inside. As the driver pulled away, she pulled out her phone and made a call. "James, schedule a board meeting for tomorrow morning. I want every department head present. We need to discuss an immediate restructuring of our hiring and training practices." Marcus smirked. "Guessing you're about to shake things up?" She gave him a side glance. "Oh, you have no idea." The next morning, Eleanor sat at the head of a long mahogany table, her executive team seated before her. The tension in the room was thick. Word had already spread about what had happened at the bank. She clasped her hands together, looking at each one of them. "I assume you all know why we're here." The head of operations, Richard Caldwell, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Sinclair, first, let me express our deepest apologies for what happened yesterday. The employees' actions were unacceptable, and we will ensure nothing like that happens again." Eleanor leaned forward, her expression unreadable. "How? What do you plan to do?" Richard hesitated. "Well, we'll increase sensitivity training and ensure." Eleanor held up a hand. "Not enough." A murmur spread across the table. "We're not just talking about one employee's mistake," she continued. "We're talking about a culture within this institution that allowed that mistake to happen in the first place." She took out a file and slid it across the table. "I had my team pull up past customer complaints and internal reports. Do you know what I found? A pattern. A pattern of bias, of employees treating customers differently based on their appearance, their background, their assumptions." Silence. "That changes today." Eleanor stood. "Effective immediately. I'm implementing a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination in any form. There will be mandatory diversity and bias training, not as a formality, but as a requirement for continued employment. I will personally oversee the restructuring of our hiring process to ensure we employ individuals who reflect our values." One of the executives, Linda Parker, leaned forward. "Mrs. Sinclair, while I agree with your stance, making changes this drastic might shake things up." Eleanor interrupted. "Good. Because if this company can evolve, it will fail. And I won't allow that to happen." The executives exchanged glances, realizing that there was no arguing with her. Eleanor Sinclair was a force to be reckoned with. Later that evening, Marcus sat in his room, scrolling through social media. News of what had happened at the bank had spread, with people debating the situation, some praising Eleanor for her swift action, while others downplayed it. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Unknown. Hey, it's Sarah from school. Saw what happened. You okay? Marcus hesitated. He barely knew Sarah, but she was one of the few students at his private school who had ever spoken to him without looking at him differently. He replied, Marcus, yeah, I'm fine. Just another day, right? A response came almost instantly. Sarah, doesn't have to be. Want to get coffee tomorrow? Marcus stared at the message for a moment, then smiled. Marcus, sure. Meanwhile, back at the bank, the employees were buzzing. Whispers filled the air as they watched Eleanor Sinclair personally oversee the restructuring process. Did you hear? She fired 2 more employees today. They're saying she's bringing in an external investigator to audit the entire staff. Man, I bet the board is freaking out. Inside Eleanor's office, the head of HR, Greg Dawson, was nervously adjusting his tie. Mrs. Sinclair, some of our senior employees are unhappy about these changes. Eleanor arched an eyebrow. Are they now? Yes. They feel targeted. Eleanor chuckled, shaking her head. That's funny. My son felt targeted yesterday, and no one cared. Greg swallowed hard. I just mean we may lose good people if they feel uncomfortable. Eleanor leaned back. Good. Because if they're uncomfortable, it means they were part of the problem. Greg had no response. Dismiss them if they resist the changes, she said simply. Find people who understand that respect and dignity are not optional. Greg hesitated but nodded. Understood. As he left, Eleanor gazed out the window, her mind racing. This was just the beginning. A week later, Marcus walked into the same bank, this time with his head held high. He was greeted warmly at the entrance, the security guard giving him a nod of respect. He approached the counter. The new teller, a young woman with a friendly smile, immediately recognized him. Good afternoon, sir. How can I assist you today? Marcus smirked. Just checking my balance. I want to make sure my mom's money is still there. The teller chuckled. Of course, Mr. Sinclair. Let me pull that up for you. As she worked, Marcus glanced around the bank. The atmosphere had changed. Employees were friendlier, the tension from before gone. The whispers of doubt had been replaced with murmurs of admiration. His phone buzzed. Sarah, coffee shop at 4? Marcus smiled. Maybe things really were changing. As Marcus stepped out of the bank, he felt a sense of satisfaction. The change in atmosphere was undeniable. The very place that had humiliated him just days ago now treated him with the respect he had always deserved. He slid his phone into his pocket, his thoughts drifting to his mother. Eleanor Sinclair was a force of nature. She hadn't just fixed a problem. She had set fire to the very roots of a broken system and was rebuilding it from the ground up. Marcus had always admired her, but now, seeing her power in action, he realized just how much of an impact she could make. He checked the time, 3:30 p.m. Still half an hour before his coffee meeting with Sarah. He figured he'd take a walk through downtown, clear his mind. The city was buzzing, people moving in every direction, conversations overlapping. As he walked past a cafe, he caught a snippet of a conversation from 2 well-dressed men sitting by the window. I'm telling you, Sinclair's changes are going to cause a serious shakeup in the industry. Other banks are watching. Yeah, but do you think it'll stick? Or is this just a PR stunt? Marcus smirked to himself. If only they knew his mother. This wasn't a PR stunt, it was a revolution. He continued walking until he reached the coffee shop. Sarah was already there, sitting by the window, stirring her iced latte. She looked up and smiled when she saw him. You're early, she said as he took a seat. Figured I'd get some fresh air before I got grilled with a million questions, Marcus teased. Sarah laughed. Okay, fair. But I am curious. What was it like seeing all that change happen so fast? Marcus exhaled, leaning back in his chair. It was satisfying, I guess, but also kind of surreal. It's one thing to hear my mom talk about power and influence, but it's another thing to see it in action. She didn't just fire a few people. She's changing the way the entire bank operates. Sarah nodded. I saw some articles online about it. People are talking. Some say she's a hero, others say she's overreacting. Marcus rolled his eyes. Figures. People don't like change, even when it's necessary. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping their drinks. Then Sarah tilted her head. So what's next? Marcus frowned. What do you mean? I mean, you've had a front row seat to all this. Your mom is obviously a powerhouse. Do you ever think about following in her footsteps? Marcus hesitated. It wasn't the first time someone had asked him that, but it was the first time he actually considered it. I don't know, he admitted. I never really thought about working in banking. I always saw it as my mom's thing. Sarah studied him for a moment. Maybe it doesn't have to be banking. But leadership? Making an impact? You clearly have it in you. Marcus chuckled. One step at a time. Right now, I'm just trying to enjoy my coffee. Sarah grinned. Fair enough. Back at the bank, Eleanor was deep in meetings. The transition wasn't smooth. There was pushback as expected. Some of the older executives grumbled about the rapid changes, claiming she was shaking the foundations too much. Eleanor, as always, remained unshaken. At the end of the day, as she walked to her car, her assistant, James, caught up with her. Ma'am, we just got a request from a major news outlet. They want to do a feature on the changes you've implemented. Eleanor sighed. I was expecting that. Send them a statement, but I don't have time for interviews right now. James hesitated. Ma'am, it's not just a small feature. They're saying other banks are now considering similar reforms. Your actions are setting a precedent. Eleanor paused. Interesting. James nodded. If this keeps up, you might not just be changing your bank. You might be changing the entire industry. Eleanor glanced at him, a thoughtful smile playing on her lips. Good. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, not everyone was thrilled about the changes. Inside a dimly lit office, 3 men sat in silence. They were senior executives, ones who had been with the bank for decades, long before Eleanor had taken over. This is getting out of hand, one of them muttered. We're losing control. She's making moves too fast. If she keeps going at this rate, we'll be obsolete. The third man, older and more composed, steepled his fingers. We need to remind her that power isn't absolute, and that it can be taken away just as quickly as it was given. The other 2 exchanged glances. What are you suggesting? The older man smirked. Let's just say it's time to remind Eleanor Sinclair that even a queen can be dethroned. The next morning, Eleanor walked into her office to find James looking pale, holding a stack of papers. You need to see this, he said, his voice tight. She took the papers and skimmed through them. Headlines, accusations, claims that she had been mismanaging bank funds, that she had been engaging in unethical hiring practices. A smear campaign. Eleanor set the papers down, her expression unreadable. Who released this? James exhaled. Sources are vague, but it's coming from within the company. Eleanor nodded slowly. Of course it is. James hesitated. Ma'am, this could damage everything you've been building. Eleanor met his gaze. Only if I let it. She picked up her phone and dialed a number. Marcus, she said when he answered. I need you to come to the office. Now. An hour later, Marcus walked into his mother's office. He could tell something was wrong the moment he saw her expression. She slid the papers across the desk. He skimmed through them, his stomach tightening. Are you serious? This is all fake. Yes, Eleanor said. But fake doesn't matter when perception becomes reality. Marcus clenched his jaw. Who did this? Eleanor exhaled. Old blood. Men who don't like change. Marcus sat down, running a hand through his hair. So what do we do? Eleanor leaned forward. We fight back. But we do it smart. No reckless moves. Marcus nodded. Tell me what you need. Eleanor smiled. That's my boy. That night, while the city slept, a storm brewed behind closed doors. Lines were drawn. Moves were made. The battle for power had only just begun. And Eleanor Sinclair never lost a battle. Marcus sat across from his mother, his mind racing with possibilities. He had always admired Eleanor Sinclair's strength, but this was different. This was war. And now he was in the middle of it. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled together. We have 2 options, she said calmly. We can play defense, release statements, deny everything, and hope the truth comes out before too much damage is done. Or, she paused, letting the weight of the next word sink in. We go on the offensive. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Meaning we find out exactly who's behind this, expose them, and ensure they regret ever trying to cross me. A smirk tugged at Marcus's lips. Now that sounds like a plan. James, who had been standing near the door, cleared his throat. Ma'am, if I may, I think we should consider both approaches. Immediate damage control, while simultaneously gathering evidence against whoever orchestrated this. Eleanor nodded. Agreed. First, we handle the media storm. Then we dismantle our enemies. Marcus leaned forward. I can help. I have connections in journalism, people who actually care about the truth. If we give them the right information, they can counter this smear campaign before it takes hold. Eleanor studied her son for a moment, then nodded. Do it. Marcus pulled out his phone, already typing a message. Give me a few hours. I'll set up the meeting. Eleanor turned to James. I need you to find out exactly who leaked this. Someone inside the company started this fire. I want to know their name. James hesitated. That won't be easy. Eleanor met his gaze, her eyes sharp as steel. Then make it easy. James swallowed hard and nodded. I'll start digging. Marcus glanced at his mother. And what about you? Eleanor smiled, but it wasn't warm. It was the smile of a woman who had spent her life breaking barriers and crushing obstacles. I have a few calls to make. Across the city, in a lavish office filled with antique furniture and the smell of expensive cigars, William Harrington sat behind his massive oak desk. He was one of the bank's oldest executives, a man who had once wielded unchecked power. Until Eleanor Sinclair arrived. He tapped his fingers on the desk as he listened to his associate. She's moving fast, the man said. Marcus is already contacting journalists. We might have underestimated him. Harrington exhaled slowly. Sinclair is a problem. She was always a problem. But problems have solutions. The associate hesitated. What are you suggesting? Harrington's lips curled into a cold smile. We tighten the noose. Push the narrative harder. Leak internal documents, real or fake, doesn't matter. Make the board question whether keeping her is worth the trouble. But what if she fights back? Harrington chuckled. She already is. But the difference between Eleanor Sinclair and me? He leaned forward. I don't play fair. Marcus sat in a dimly lit cafe, stirring his coffee as he waited. The journalist he had contacted, David Collins, finally arrived, sliding into the seat across from him. Marcus, David said, setting his recorder on the table. I read the articles. This is a full-scale hit job. Tell me something I don't know, Marcus muttered. David leaned in. The question is, do you have proof that it's a setup? Marcus exhaled. Not yet. But we will. David studied him. If I run a story countering this narrative without hard evidence, I'll be putting my reputation on the line. You want evidence? Marcus smirked. Give me 24 hours. David hesitated, then nodded. All right, 24 hours. As David left, Marcus pulled out his phone and called James. Tell me you have something. James's voice was low. I do. And you're not going to like it. Back at the bank, Eleanor sat across from one of her board members, Olivia Kensington, a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind. Eleanor, Olivia began, there's pressure from certain members of the board to suspend you while this investigation unfolds. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Let me guess. Harrington's influence. Olivia nodded. He's pulling strings. And if you don't act fast, you might not have a position to defend. Eleanor took a slow sip of her tea. Then I suppose I need to act faster. Olivia leaned in. I believe in what you're doing. But you need to understand, these men play dirty. You have to be prepared for whatever comes next. Eleanor's gaze hardened. I always am. That night, Marcus and James met in an underground parking garage. James handed him a file. This is it. Proof that Harrington and his people planted the leaks. Marcus flipped through the pages, his anger boiling. And the board has no idea? They suspect. but they need undeniable evidence. Marcus closed the file. Then let's give it to them. The next morning, Eleanor walked into the boardroom, the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. Across the table sat her opponents, led by Harrington, who wore a smug expression. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrington began, "it is clear that the recent allegations against Eleanor Sinclair have caused significant turmoil for our institution. In light of this, I propose a temporary suspension until the matter is resolved." Murmurs of agreement spread through the room. Eleanor remained calm. "And if I refuse?" Harrington smirked. "Then we vote." Eleanor glanced at Marcus, who nodded and stood up. "Before you vote," Marcus said, sliding the file onto the table, "you might want to read this." Harrington's smirk faltered. One of the board members picked up the file, his eyes widening as he read. "These are internal communications, emails detailing how the allegations were fabricated." Another board member frowned. "Harrington, is this true?" Harrington's face turned pale. "This is nonsense." Eleanor finally spoke. "Is it?" She leaned forward. "Because I have more. Financial records, wire transfers, evidence linking you to journalists who published the false reports." The room fell silent. Olivia cleared her throat. "Well, it seems we need a new vote." 15 minutes later, Harrington was escorted out of the building. Eleanor watched as he disappeared through the doors, then turned to Marcus. "You did good." Marcus smiled. "So what's next?" Eleanor exhaled. "Now, we rebuild." And as they walked out together, Marcus knew this was only the beginning.